आज का जो टॉपिक है क्लाइमेट चेंज। आप सबको पता है कि बहुत ही प्रेसिंग इशू है आज टुडे का। कहीं ना कहीं इतना बड़ा ग्लोबल एक क्लाइमेट क्राइसिस है जिसके लिए ग्लोबल एफर्ट की रिक्वायरमेंट है। तो उसी कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हम एक सीरीज ऑफ लेक्चर्स स्टार्ट कर रहे हैं, जिसका एक फर्स्ट लेक्चर है जिसको डॉक्टर रोहित आजाद कंटिन्यू करेंगे। आप सबको पता है कि अगर हिस्टोरिकल पर्सपेक्टिव से देखें क्लाइमेट चेंज के बारे में, तो क्लब ऑफ रोम का जो रिपोर्ट आता है लिमिट्स टू ग्रोथ, वहां से 70s में स्टार्ट होती है इसका डिस्कशन लेके कि कैसे रिसोर्स क्राइसिस एक है और फ्यूचर जनरेशन के लिए कैसे एक रिसोर्स उनको बचा के रखना है। फिर 80s में 87 में हम देखते हैं कि ब्रंटलैंड रिपोर्ट आता है, जिसको और कॉमन फ्यूचर नाम से जो डिफाइन करता है सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट को कि डेवलपमेंट which meets the needs of present generation without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs। फिर इसी क्रम में आगे हम बढ़ते हैं तो 90s में जो अर्थ समिट, यूनाइटेड नेशंस फ्रेमवर्क कन्वेंशन है क्लाइमेट चेंज का, जो एक एनुअल सीओपी मीटिंग्स होती है, ये प्रोसेस चलता है। फिर क्योटो प्रोटोकॉल 15 में पेरिस एग्रीमेंट, फिर मिलेनियम डेवलपमेंट गोल्स को सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट गोल्स से रिप्लेस किया जाता है। उसी क्रम में एक हिस्टोरिकल पर्सपेक्टिव है कि कैसे एक हिस्टोरिकल एजेंडा इंस्टीट्यूशनल एफर्ट्स इसमें डाला जाता है। लेकिन इसको अगर हम बात करें तो कहीं ना कहीं एक ग्लोबल डिवाइड देखने को मिलता है, ग्लोबल नॉर्थ में और ग्लोबल साउथ में। ग्लोबल साउथ की कंट्रीज ये क्लेम करती हैं कि जो ग्लोबल नॉर्थ की कंट्रीज हैं, जो डेवलप कंट्रीज हैं, हिस्टोरिकली उनका कंट्रीब्यूशन बहुत रहा है कार्बन एमिशंस में। अगर हम 70s से लेके काफी पहले समय से हिस्टोरिकल एमिशन देखें तो केवल यूएसए और यूरोपियन यूनियन मिलके ऑलमोस्ट 50% ज्यादा उनका हिस्टोरिकल कंट्रीब्यूशन दिखेगा। वहीं ग्लोबल नॉर्थ की जो कंट्रीज हैं वो क्लेम करती हैं कि जो ग्लोबल साउथ की कंट्रीज है, फास्ट ग्रोइंग कंट्रीज हैं, कहीं ना कहीं उनका जो ग्रोथ पैटर्न है वो सस्टेनेबल नहीं है। जैसे चाइना की बात करें, वो कहते हैं इंडिया चाइना जैसे भी आप हिस्टोरिकल कंट्रीब्यूशन देखें तो कहीं ना कहीं अप्रोक्सीमेट 13-14% उसका भी कंट्रीब्यूशन है चाइना का। इंडिया का भी 4% कंट्रीब्यूशन है। हालांकि पर कैपिटा एमिशन जो है उतना ज्यादा नहीं है, लेकिन एब्सोल्यूट बेसिस पे भी एक कंट्रीब्यूशन है। तो वो क्लेम करते हैं कि जो ग्लोबल साउथ की कंट्रीज हैं वो भी काफी कंट्रीब्यूट कर रही हैं। तो इसको लेके एक डिवाइड चलता रहता है हमेशा ग्लोबल साउथ और ग्लोबल नॉर्थ के बीच में। और कहीं ना कहीं जो बात होती है कि कैसे क्लाइमेट चेंज को डील किया जाए, तो क्लाइमेट चेंज में एक फ्लो और स्टॉक कंसेप्ट की बात करते हैं। जैसे हमने हिस्टोरिकल पर्सपेक्टिव की बात की कि हिस्टोरिकली किसने कितना कंट्रीब्यूट किया है और करंट में क्या एमिशंस है, तो इसके लेकर हम एडॉप्शन की बात करते हैं, एडॉप्टेशन की बात करते हैं और मिटिगेशन की बात करते हैं। और आज ग्लोबल लेवल पे क्योंकि मिटिगेशन का मतलब सीधे यही है कि जो क्लाइमेट चेंज हुआ है उसके नेगेटिव इम्पैक्ट को कैसे हम कंट्रोल करें, तो उसमें ग्लोबल डेवलप कंट्रीज है उनको लीड लेना चाहिए। लेकिन आजकल ज्यादा बात मिटिगेशन पे हो रही है, तो ये सब बेसिकली बैकग्राउंड है जिसको लेके रोहित सर इस टॉक को कंटिन्यू करेंगे। सो आई वेलकम डॉक्टर रोहित आजाद। आई थिंक कि इंट्रोडक्शन की जरूरत नहीं है, हम कहें कि एक एक्टिविस्ट के तौर पे और एक एकेडमिशियंस के तौर पे जो स्टडी एंड स्ट्रगल का नारा हम देते हैं उसके मिसाल के तौर पे हम डॉक्टर रोहित को देखते हैं। जो लोग, मुझे नहीं लगता कि यहाँ कोई मौजूद होगा जो इनको नहीं जानता होगा, और मैं कहूंगा कि जो लोग नहीं भी जानते हैं तो जेएनयू में आके अगर आप रोहित आजाद को नहीं जाने तो आपने क्या जाना। तो सबसे पहले आप जाइए, यूट्यूब से बहुत सारे वीडियोस पड़े हुए हैं जो जेएनयू के पार्ट थे, उनके वीडियोस देखिए, उससे एक्टिविज्म सीखिए। बहुत सारे पेपर्स पड़े हुए हैं पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी पर्सपेक्टिव से, डिफरेंट एंगल्स को, डिफरेंट इश्यूज को देखने की, पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी पर्सपेक्टिव को समझना है तो उनके पेपर्स पढ़िए, यही उनको जानने का सही तरीका है। सो ओवर टू यू।
थैंक यू। सो अब वो उम्र रही नहीं कि ऐसे पॉलिटिकल स्पीच दें, तो मैं एकेडमिक ही बोलूँगा। So what I'm going to do is I've been asked to give 3 lectures. I don't know who's going to attend all 3, but let me still, since I've been asked, I'll do it in the following manner. The first lecture is going to be, and language, should I mix Hindi, English, what would you prefer? Whichever one you want to, I can keep it mixed as he did. So the first lecture is going to be on the global perspective on the issue of climate change. The second is essentially on taking India as an example of what India could do in this context. And the third, which is, in my opinion, or it's part of our joint work, in our opinion, when you want to make a change, it has to start locally. So the third perspective, I mean, the third lecture is going to be on Delhi as an example of what can be done as we as Delhi residents, can we contribute to this, or rather contributing, can we actually be a part of a political movement which challenges this problem and takes it head on. काफ़ी कुछ कॉन्टेक्स्ट जो है ऑलरेडी मेरे प्रीवियस वक्ता ने दे दिया है, तो मैं उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट से ही इस्तेमाल करते हुए आपको कुछ चीज़ें दिखाऊंगा. सो द रीज़न वाई आई हैव अ पीपीटी फर्स्ट एंड फॉरमोस्ट इज it's not possible to explain what I'm going to explain without the stark data that you would see. Most of it you come across. I mean, you hear about it in news, you hear about it in papers. If you are interested in climate change, you get to hear about it from various perspectives. But still, the starkness of it, in my opinion at least, despite knowing that they have contributed the most, global north has contributed the most, everybody knows they have, but how much and what exactly are we looking at? Before I go into all those details, I want to give you a background of, and this I have learned from a friend of mine who is a climate change activist. वो एक टॉक में शायद यहीं पे आए थे, जेएनयू में आए थे, तो मैंने उनसे पूछा कि हाउ डू यू एक्सप्लेन, आई मीन क्लाइमेट चेंज एक कॉमन उसमें आप कैसे समझाएंगे कॉमन नॉलेज के टर्म्स में. तो उसने एक एग्जाम्पल दिया था जो मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा था. आप सब लोग जो है ठंड में रजाई ओढ़ते हैं, राइट? एवरीबडी यूजेज अ क्विल्ट. And if you want to understand climate change in very simple, those of you who know it, of course, would not need to understand it like that. But उसने बहुत एक सीधे तरीके से ये दिखाया था कि अगर आप रजाई जब ओढ़ रहे हैं तो एक टेम्परेचर के हिसाब से ओढ़ रहे हैं, राइट? जितनी ठंड है उतनी मोटी रजाई आप ओढ़ेंगे. वो रजाई एसेंशियली ट्रैप करती है हीट को, जिसके कारण आपका बॉडी वार्म रहता है. Carbon dioxide is essentially like that. It's basically a razai for the environment as a whole, for our planet as a whole. Some bit of it is required, as you know from basic science, that without heat, without water, I mean, the life that we see on Earth would not have existed without the temperature that we live in. And carbon dioxide, of course, plays a very important role in that. The problem, however, is कि आप मान लीजिए दिल्ली की ठंड में आपके ऊपर 4 रजाई जो है लाद दी जाए, 4, 5, 6, 7, आप समझ सकते हैं आपके साथ क्या होगा. जितनी रजाई की जरूरत है उतनी ही आप लेंगे. इफ यू कवर इट विद एक्स्ट्रा क्विल्ट, देन इट्स गोइंग टू जनरेट अ लॉट मोर हीट. That's exactly what we are doing essentially in terms of climate change. The excess of carbon dioxide is what is leading to a rise in temperature. We've already crossed, as you may know, the 1 degree centigrade, the limit, if you begin from the Industrial Revolution. So Industrial Revolution happens to be the benchmark. Why it is the benchmark, you'll be able to understand with this just small. So this is, in multiple, and Trump is the best example of that. So Trump was, when he was contesting last time, वो शायद कैलिफोर्निया में या कहीं नहीं, कहाँ गए थे? हाँ, कैलिफोर्निया में ही, और भाषण दे रहे थे. भाषण देते देते उन्होंने बोला कि वेयर इज व्हाट ग्लोबल वार्मिंग, देयर इज नो ग्लोबल वार्मिंग. आप लोगों को गर्मी लग रही है? तो लोगों ने, जनता नहीं, अब रिपब्लिकन्स थे तो उन्होंने जवाब भी वैसे ही दिया, नहीं नहीं गर्मी नहीं लग रही है. तो उन्होंने बोला देखिए, है ही नहीं ग्लोबल वार्मिंग. ठंड, मुझे ठंड लग रही है गर्मी के मौसम में, तो ग्लोबल वार्मिंग कैसे हो सकता है? एंड दिस, आई मीन, इट्स ट्रू दैट वो ट्रंप ऐसे बोल रहे थे, बट इफ यू आस्क those who are climate change deniers, they would give you this obvious, I mean, usual answer that basically it's a temperature variation. It has happened earlier, not a big deal. You've had ice ages. This is just another phase of that. Except कि उस समय कौन एक्सटिंक्ट हुआ था, अब हम हो जाएंगे एक्सटिंक्ट, वो अलग बात है. लेकिन as far as the climate change thing is concerned, it's by and large just a variation in temperature, which is within the range, and hence there is nothing exceptional. But this one chart will, or at least I hope it will, make you understand why that is not true. So what I've done here is, this is very simply, you can go Our World in Data, it has extensive data on this. So what I've done is, this is basically the last ice age that Earth saw. There have been many ice ages, as you know. So I've basically picked the carbon emission during that time, because carbon emission has been happening all through. Whether the current phase that we are in, is it Anthropocene as they call it, is it man-made, or is it just natural and it happens to be as it happened to be earlier? So one can easily start with the process that let's check from the last ice age to where we are now, and how things have actually panned out in these many years. And as you can see, this is way back in the past. So if you look at this, what it is doing is basically, this is, as I said, the last ice age, and this is our current time, and this is essentially carbon dioxide concentration. So just look at that thing. That's where we are. And this line, that jump that you see is 1750. That's the Industrial Revolution. Within a span of a couple of centuries and a half, you actually see this jump that has taken place here. Now, it's obvious that this is nothing else but us. It can't be, it's not natural, it cannot be natural, because if it were so, then all these, so now in this plot now, you have all the various ice ages that you know of. So this is one, this is two. So, you know, those who are economic students, it's like a business cycle of concentration of carbon dioxide, and you have an average here. But this is just beyond the charts. It's not something that you can think of as something natural. So obviously we have done something here which is making us pay what we are, or we are going to pay rather in the future. Now the question is whether, one second. So what? I mean, carbon has, as I said, this is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 quilts when it is not required. What was required was just one. We have created a monster in the form of this that you see here. This is pure just from the Industrial Revolution. So the first phase, that the first part of the chart that you saw in the previous one has been removed. So this is from 1741 up to this point. You can see the sharp rise that has taken place in the 20th century itself. So the focus of all of these discussions is essentially obviously post the Industrial Revolution. And that it corresponds to a rise in temperature can be seen with this. So this goes up, and you essentially have average temperature anomaly globally. So when you say, I'm not a scientist, but when you say usually that when it goes up by 1%, it does not, 1 degree does not mean across the board it's going to go up by 1 degree. In certain regions of the world, it's going to go up by 4. In some, maybe 0.5. So by and large, on an average, it has gone up by 1 degree Celsius. Now, whenever we have said, when we say 1 degree Celsius, everybody in Delhi says, अरे कौन सी बड़ी बात है, 48 था 49 हो जाएगा, बहुत हुआ तो 50 डिग्री हो जाएगा, उससे ज़्यादा क्या ही हो जाएगा दिल्ली में. सवाल वो नहीं है. सवाल ये है कि दिल्ली में वो कितना होगा, पहली बात तो हम प्रिडिक्ट नहीं कर सकते. वो 1 डिग्री से ज़्यादा भी हो सकता है, 2 भी हो सकता है, 3 भी हो सकता है. And especially around the equator and the tropical countries, you're going to, and as you will see just in a moment, that the temperature variation is going to be dramatic. I mean, unlike, in fact, even in the ice caps predictions, the scientific predictions themselves have a huge range in terms of what this will result in. So what we have already seen is that 1 degree Celsius rise from where we began, and that has already taken place. That is something that we cannot undo. And that's the problem with carbon. Carbon is something which has a life of 10,000 years. I mean, you won't, again, something which is mind-boggling. What we emit today, let's say in this talk itself, is going to stay for at least 10% of this is going to stay for 10,000 years. So what matters is stock of carbon as much as the flow of carbon itself. It's not something which can be deaccumulated, that you can just remove it from the atmosphere. So this is essentially telling you the carbon dioxide concentration and the corresponding rise in global temperatures that you see there, both these plots. This is not incidental. This is scientifically proven. If you ask an environmental scientist, they will tell you in more detail of what these climate models essentially predict, that without doubt, now there is no doubt about the fact that we are the ones who are responsible for it. I am not a scientist, as I said, so I'm only going to discuss the economics of it. And the first and foremost thing, in my opinion, on when it comes to carbon, it's about equality of that carbon space. How is it to be divided across individuals? So one way, which is called the carbon budget framework, what it essentially does is that, let's say if you have X amount of carbon to reach, let's say 2 degrees Celsius, that's the max that you can go up to, beyond which things are just going to go off the charts. We'll not know what's going to happen. By the way, when I'm talking about 2 degrees Celsius, those who are from economics, this debate has happened in economics for long. of what is the optimal level of rise in temperature. Somebody like William Nordos has actually argued that 4 degrees is not that bad. I mean, cost benefit analysis actually tells you 4 degrees just about okay. There have been debates from the other side. Nicholas Stern has written about it that no, 4 degrees not, absolutely not what you should. And the argument for 4 degrees is that we'll adapt. There will be technology, there will be adaptation to that new temperature. Maybe we'll all be walking in some AC suits. I don't know what the technological response would be. But in economics, at least in mainstream economics, a cost benefit analysis somehow has resulted in, I mean, those who are interested can read about that debate between the two. And they say, one says that 4 degree is okay, and the other obviously refutes it and sets a 2 degree Celsius as something which we should definitely try and achieve. Scientists are now clear, as with every IPCC report, those of you who have read about it or want to read about it, they've clearly stated now that there is at this rate, the rate at which we are growing, by 2050, we would have crossed the 2 degrees Celsius on our own if we do nothing about it. So that's a given. Number two, which is even more alarming, is the carbon space that we are left with. I'll come to that. The carbon space that we are left with, that carbon space is going to get over with just 1/3 of the fossil fuels that we have, not the new ones, the existing reserves. If we were to burn 1/3 of that itself, we would have exhausted the carbon space entirely. So we would have touched the 2 degree. So it's obvious the only way you can stop this is by, as the slogan goes, many young people like you who are part of these movements have given a slogan in the global north that keep oil in the soil. That's the only way in which you can actually counter this problem. So I'll come to those issues in a bit. And it's not just the responsibility of the North, but I'll come to that a little later. So what this chart does is, so the colors are all, so think of this as one line, and there is another actually bar here. What this is telling you is basically, let's say this is the total carbon space that you have currently. So this line that you see there, this is what you have in terms of hitting the 2 degrees Celsius limit. Obviously, for 1.5 degree, you will have a lower limit, which was the Paris Agreement, that we should not cross beyond 1.5. Now, most people believe that 1.5 we are crossing for sure. At least let us limit to 2. And limiting to 2 would mean basically a box of this size is what we are left with, or what we had rather. This of that we've already used up. So it's obvious that we are only left with a small part of the carbon space that we should at worst hit. That part that you have here obviously is the same here. I mean, the used up part is the same because it's saying 1.5 degree. So I'm not going to discuss the 1.5 degrees Celsius currently, because I mean, all the discussion that I'm going to do can be discussed in terms of 1.5 or 2. It doesn't make a difference which one you pick, except obviously the space would be far less if you have 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is what has led to a rise in 1 degree Celsius already. And this is the space that you are left with. So an obvious question that, and these bars that you see here, the error bar, is essentially in terms of probability, that all climatic predictions are essentially in terms of probability. So what you usually do is you take the 67% range as the one that you quote, and then you say that if it happens to be the case that it's not leading to a rise in temperature as much with that higher probability, then you have this much space. That's the outer limit. So very low probability that we'll have this much space. In all likelihood, we have only this much space. So there is supposed to be a bar here which is showing in mine, but not in yours. You see that line there? That's the limit up to which you can go. So the obvious question is, how do we distribute this space that we have, the balanced space, so to speak? And if I can make it interactive so that, what do you think? What should we do as people who are actually going to face it the most? If you have that much space left, how do you distribute? What would your recommendation be? Sorry, it doesn't look like a public talk. It has been converted into a class. But that is just to keep the thing interactive. What do you think? What should you do? Let's say this is the space that we are left with. How do you distribute it among people? Is there a principle that you can come up with which can ensure some sort of fairness? Yes. Okay. But why? Yeah. Sorry. According to the population. Okay. All right. Anything else? Yes. Right. Correct. So what should we do? In the global south, you're sitting in a seminar room in the global south. There is no Uncle Sam sitting and checking. So let's have a discussion that what should we do? Absolutely, I agree with you. So what do we do? What should we do? Forget about how we do it or whether we'll be able to achieve it or not. That's a separate matter. But all these COPs, for example, where these discussions take place, at least there you go with a model, right? You go with an ideal thing that you want to achieve. Just as you believe there is imperialism, you fight against it, you fight it with idealism. What you will achieve in that fight, you don't know as yet. But the point is, what should that fight be? What should that claim be? What should that be? Yes.
Looking at historically who has used per capita the most,
correct,
what, and per capita, then who should get the most after.
Okay. So let's say that they've exceeded their per capita. Then what do we do? Yes.
I think, as you pointed out, like COP and all. First thing, I think there is a we can make a provision for technological transfer. First thing, and second thing, most of the nations were ready to cut their emissions, but finally, some of the countries they didn't approve that act. That we need to take into account and we make it to try to bring it to the reality. So
Okay.
this is one of my
Okay, so before I go further, let me show you the next thing. This, in my opinion, is, again, it's not showing, but I'll explain. Give me 2 minutes. So what we have is basically all that we have emitted so far. If you were to split that stock into half and half, right? So let's say you have emitted 100,000 tons, let's say. So by when did we emit 500, and the next 500, when did we emit? If we split time like that, the reason why I'm doing it is I'm giving you a sense of stock and flow and the growth as it matters. And we also didn't know this would be true, but we found it alarming that what we emitted in 2 centuries, 200 years, we have emitted the same amount in 3 decades from 1992. So you can imagine the speed at which we are going. So it literally, I mean, those of you who have seen Titanic, old film, our generation ka huge hit it was. Leonardo DiCaprio, and that film was about what? That these guys could not see the iceberg, as you know about Titanic, and it hit by mistake. It headed in that direction, and they were just confident that that ship is built with that kind of technology that it will never sink, but it did. Here, we see the iceberg literally, and we are hitting it full speed. With this, when we know that we don't really have time, as I've said, that if we do not act by 2030, then there's nothing we can do. It's autopilot mode. Then all of us, I mean, more or less, by and large, forget about taking a vacation. Those of you who are interested in taking a vacation to Goa or Bombay or any of these cities, half of them, Sri Lanka, Maldives, is anyway getting submerged. All of this is going to happen. But jokes aside, the way it is going to affect the livelihood of people, particularly in those regions where the sea is going to rise, and the sea rise itself is, by the way, just as a digression, when you hear that there is a 1 centimeter rise of water, you usually see that 1 centimeter is nothing, it's only this much, right? So it's not a big deal. It's like that 1 degree. 1 degree दिल्ली में क्या फर्क पड़ जाता है, कि फर्क पैंदा, well, 48, 49, 50, so does not matter. This 1 centimeter, think of it slightly in your जिन लोगों ने ट्रिग्नोमेट्री किया है उनको थोड़ा, सभी लोग करते हैं स्कूल में, तो 10th तक तो करना ही पड़ता है, मैथ्स क्या करें, मजबूरी है. सो रिमेंबर द इंक्लाइन, right? If it's a flat surface, then 1 centimeter, 1 centimeter is going to actually flood it way inside the city. Am I making sense? If the incline is like this, then it'll stop here. If the incline is almost parallel, almost zero, then this 1 centimeter is going to go all the way inside the city. So 1 centimeter is not just 1 centimeter. It is about the incline at which it hits the cities. So imagine if Bombay or Goa or Puri or Calcutta, if these cities are cities which are on the surface level with a flatter coastline, then you are actually going to see the sea literally entering into the home. So that 1 centimeter is not a small number, so to speak, other than acidity and all of that. Given this, what do we do is what I was asking. So let's first look at who has taken us to this brink of a disaster. And this chart, sorry, the colors are all, but I think it's visible, at least I can explain. So the numbers that you see here, this is 4.03, 0.55, 0.43, 0.17. This requires some explanation. So just stay with me for some time. What these numbers are essentially, oh, I have to stand here, right? So the numbers here are essentially telling you the ratio of your emissions vis-a-vis the ratio, the share that you have in global population. So anything greater than 1 is obviously you have gone beyond your fair share, right? So if it's 1, I have a population of 10%, I have taken the carbon space of 10%. So it's break even. But if I'm more than 1, then I've taken more than my fair share in carbon space. This is not the existing carbon space. This is not of what they have taken from the existing one. This is of all. If you were to take the 2 degrees Celsius as the carbon space, we have not fully emitted. So this is exhausting all that possibility. Then how much have they taken? Am I making sense? It's not fourth of the existing share. It's way beyond that. All carbon emitted, hypothetically, of that, what would have been their share versus what they've actually already emitted. This is 4 times their share of the population. 4 times as much as their fair share they would have. So even if we were to stop it right here, right now, you still can't do anything about it. Am I making sense? So it's not something that you can go back in time and, kind of re-sign what you have already emitted. You can't do that. So you have to live with the existing reality that they have already emitted way beyond their fair share. Now my question comes back. Now that you know that they have emitted 4 times their fair share, what do we do now? Let's say we stop, we completely decarbonize their economies right away here and emissions stop. Obviously, that's not going to happen, but let's say, hypothetically speaking, we do that. Would that still solve the problem? Solve the problem of justice, not of climate change, but of justice? Or it's still not just? They have crossed, so we stop, that you can't emit anymore. Let's say COP, the next thing that you say is your emissions, you have crossed the limit, you stop here. Or would you argue for something more? Yes.
The ideal answer, I think, would be we redefine what growth is, we redefine how we live. But practically, I mean, that would mean actually sacrificing our daily existence of what we use in our daily lives. And by that, I mean from industrial agriculture to the internet we use. And that would mean a dive in how we live, our living conditions. And I think that's almost, let's say, a necessity by this point. And I don't mean just the global north, I mean the entire
Global south, the world economy as a whole. Fair enough.
I think we can borrow examples from decolonial movements from the South America, which would mean that we could use the argument that climate change is a colonial thing, and so that if you're decolonizing it, we actually, let's say, reduce our consumption by some ideal image of the decolonization.
Okay, but who should do that?
Practically everybody should do that.
Practically everybody. Okay. Yeah.
Sir, when we are talking about climate change and you talk about climate justice,
Right.
then we have to not have to parallelly work on multiple things. For instance, like if you're to combat the climate change, we have to work on global level as well, and at the same time we have to work on local level. For instance, for that we can take the help of ecological justice also. So these things can supplement these things to combat the climate change. Like in the across our country, for instance, if you look at the entire natural rich areas, social rich areas, Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, and some other places, forest rich and minerals rich, then we can see that many of the farm and corporations are coming up. They are trying to capture their entire resources, and they're trying to make them away, evict those places, and they are telling them, okay, 5% you will give the share. We want to develop these areas, but they are damaging entire area, and this is not happening only in our country, it is happening across the world. So if we are going to work on those fronts, definitely we can bring some changes. But if we are thinking in a bag, like okay, we can sit in the Paris, London, Johannesburg, and it's very difficult. And see, there are four pillars, as you already pointed out: social, cultural, economical, and one is ecological. So on all the four fronts, we have to work. Otherwise, this climate change talk debates is not going to be very good for in even in the upcoming years. So this is my take. We have to work on multiple fronts, local to global, on regional level. So we have to go with these idea as well as well.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, what is required, of course, so I agree with you. I'm not saying that we don't need to work on it together. The question is how, and the question is on what. I mean, what are the, yes.
I think there's also the question of reparations and climate
Correct.
reparations. That it's not just that they stop, but that they make amends for it. Like for instance, from Pacific Small Island developing states, you have a demand for land because no matter how much you stop emissions now, there are islands which
Already.
are going to sink.
Sure.
So people need to be like there's
Compensated for
yeah,
that.
there's question of plan relocation to other countries which have contributed to the the climate change from which they're sinking. So that question of reparation should also come in, considering the inequality in the.
Sure. So I'll come to that towards the end of. Yes. Yes.
Like we can do one more thing, like we can provide like renewal rights. Like for instance, we have
What right? Sorry.
renewal rights, land rights, and
Right.
FRA came into existence, biodiversity came into existence, but they are talking like we need to provide the rights of the tribal people to their own land, so they can conserve and preserve those areas, and at the same time it is going to be very beneficial to combat the climate change and some other if it comes from very particular like deforestation, water and all. These are all the very little plus more components which come in the way of climate change. Like if we are talking about the conservation, in the name of national park and some other things. But and we are trying to displace the people away from there without recognizing and setting their rights. What will happen in the next future? They are going to completely, be neutral. They are not going to take care of their jungles and forests. And we know Adivasi and the forest dwellers are the real keeper of the jungle. So if we are trying to decentralize these things, so this decentralization can also bring a big change to support the idea.
Yeah. So if this, sorry, I'm bringing it back to these charts on the right hand side. So this is done as countries. So that's the global north. This is South America. This is Asia without Japan, because Japan happens to be G7. So Japanese are not Asian in that sense. They are. But economically, they are not. They are way up there. And this, of course, is Africa. So the share that they have is 0.717, which means they've only taken 0.17 of what their share should have been. If you do a similar thing, not with respect to countries like that, but in terms, I mean, continent or regions like that, but you do it with respect to, let's say, specific countries, or so here you have a North American, the maximum that emissions that we know of. This is a European, the second one. The third is the world average. This is in terms of the annual average emissions based on consumption, 2015 tons per person. And look at where China is. So it's close to the average. Actually, little over average it's going. This is old data. The South Asian, all of us essentially, it's 2.2, and an African is 1.9. So that's the extent. You can see the difference here. They're 10 times as high. One person, a North American, in the same, let's say, income category also, you will see that huge variation in the next chart that I show you, which is, no, this one. So look at, and this is quite fascinating. This is from Financial Times. Again, not really visible, but I'll explain. This is United States. What these two essentially are representing, the brown and the blue dots, this is the bottom 50%, their emission, average emission. And this is the top 10%, so the elite, the richest of these countries. Just look at the variation that you have here with respect to all the, even in the other richer countries, the top 10%. There's a huge gap that you see there. There is a gap within the country. So we already saw that there is a gap across countries, but there's a huge class gap within countries as well. I'll particularly talk about India when we discuss in the second lecture. This variation tells you that the bottom 50% of the American population versus the bottom 50% of India, which is the last one here, there is, within that, there is a huge variation. So across classes, within countries, across classes, and across countries, there is a huge variation. So class and the fact the global political economy, both these things need to be at the center of any solution that we think of about climate change. This is especially so because of this chart. There are many charts here, but you will perhaps get a sense. So the upper chart, you basically have two, world maps here. The upper one is essentially telling you the dark red colors that you see are essentially countries which have overshot their share. So they are so-called deficit countries, in the sense that, let's say if you have a budget, you've crossed the budget, so you're on a deficit. Usually in economics, we have a budget line. You cross that budget line, you've crossed over from what you have as your fair share. So all those guys are in red here. So they are cross the red line. The ones which are green or yellow, or basically literally the global south that you see here, are the countries which are below their fair share. Some way below their fair share, and some still below the fair share. So all the greens are in the positive. So you can call them surplus countries, and the ones which are in red all up here, so Russia, all of Europe, United States, Canada, the usual countries, usual culprits that we know of. But look at the chart below. It's a, you can see, if I were to keep a mirror here, it would be a mirror image of that. The lower chart essentially is telling you the effect of climate change in multiple ways. So what they have done is, this is not our paper, what they have done is they have taken all the possible impacts that climate change can have. Health, in terms of mortality, in terms of agricultural production, jobs, so on and so forth. All of that, if you combine into an index, they create an index of multidimensional climate vulnerability. The countries which are affected the most are dark red now. So you can see those who have contributed are going to be least affected by it, and those who have contributed the least are going to be the most affected by it. So nothing could be more unjust than that. Not only do you not get your fair share, but the effect that the others have inflicted on you, you are going to face the brunt of that. This is a quote from George Monbiot, who said that those who are least responsible, unfortunately, on climate change, like many other things, they have to bear the brunt of it. Any discussion on climate justice, therefore, has to address that. But there are certain serious problems with that, and that's what I want to discuss now. But before I go there, yes?
So actually, COP always talks about the adaptation and mitigation.
Right.
And then it says that for the developing countries, adaptation is very costly and mitigation. Therefore, they usually go for the mitigation. Developed nation, they have all the facilities, and they like this work. They are okay with the adaptation and mitigation. So talking to the political
developing banks and other IMF, they should push the lobby to give funds to the developing nation for their adaptation in these, because they are they're having lack of funds. So that might.
Have you ever heard of the IMF ever saying anything progressive for the developing country?
That is what
So don't expect the IMF to be doing it. I agree with you. That's exactly what it should be doing. By the way, IMF per se as an institution was created with a different idea altogether. This was the idea of, a progressive economist, John Maynard Keynes, who believed that countries which are running in deficit of credit, they should get it free of cost from those who have surplus credit. So that is what he had imagined the IMF to be doing. Quite the opposite of what they are doing. That's a separate matter. No. There will be justice. There will be justice. There should be justice. But that justice doesn't need to come through institutions. We are already unjust. We know that they are unjust institutions. They need to be replaced. And that, so I'll come to that. वो पंच लाइन है, थोड़ा क्लाइमेक्स होने दो यार, फिल्म का पहले से ही थोड़ी सब हो जाएगा. So, but at the same time, this whole debate on global north being responsible alone is something that we should be careful about, because I had shown to you, and this is about looking at our own self. When I said that what we emitted in 2 centuries, we have emitted in the last 3 decades alone. China is a big player in that. Even if you leave aside the consumption production debate, which I can discuss if you like, even if you leave that aside, there is a contribution on the consumption side itself of China, which is quite alarming. So it should not be, it's not a, लखनऊ में एक वो होता है ना, पहले आप ट्रेन में चढ़ने के लिए जब तक पहले आप हुआ और ट्रेन ही निकल गई, तो वो पहले आप वाली चीज is not going to work as far as climate change is concerned. Hence the question is, everybody needs to contribute, but how much? That is something that one needs to. This chart will actually show you why we should not say, we should not believe that it is not our responsibility at all. And you will see it just in a moment. Give me a minute. So this is total carbon emissions for 3 different regions. We have created, this is from our recent paper, 3 different regions. One is, let's say, the global north that we've been discussing. From the global south, we have picked up the BRICS countries, because those are the emerging, developing, advanced, within the developing countries. So you can take them together, and rest of the world. So all the world put together is the rest of the world. And this is basically your total carbon emissions from oil. You can see that obviously the global north is up there. This is not per capita. This is just total. From gas, again, this dotted line is rest of the world. This is BRICS, and this is the global north. So you can see there is some plateauing of the oil consumption, but that has basically been replaced by gas. That's essentially what has happened in the global north. And this is coal. That's exactly where we are picking up. And coal is something that is, one cannot argue that you can fight climate change and keep coal. That's not something that, and I'll come to the issue of development there, whether we need to give up on our development if we give up on coal. So those discussions also we'll come back to. But let's say that this is not a fair thing to say, because you're taking total emissions. Let's do per capita emissions. And in per capita emissions, of course, the global north goes way up there. That also is plateauing for the simple reason that their population is more or less constant in this phase. So you would find the same pattern that you find here in terms of the per capita emission as well. But obviously the gap has changed dramatically, because the population here in the global south is much higher. If you look at gas here, this is increasing as it was increasing here. Again, the gap has increased. But look at coal. Just look at this portion. This is a rise in BRICS per capita emissions, which has gone beyond the global north. That's not a small thing. It's not just this jump that you see here. It's the per capita emission which has crossed. So it is something that we need to also take seriously, of why and what can we do about it. Because this is not something, as I said, once you have emitted, you can't go back in time. It's not something which can be changed. Coal emitted once is, carbon emitted once is carbon emitted for all times to come. If you were to do it split, so within oil, if you do global north as a whole, then no surprises there. The United States is way up there. It's the highest emitting oil economy in the world, and within the global north, the maximum. Well, what you find here, again, we did not expect this. Look at the emissions of China. It's, I mean, shooting, going through the roof, or whatever you want to call it. It's a dramatic rise. So it's not surprising that you actually find them touching the global average and crossing. So their flows, all these are essentially flows of emissions, right? But these are the things which build up to stock. Every flow is an addition to the previous stock. That's how the stock is building up. And China, in that sense, is way, way beyond the rest of the BRICS nations. But look at India. You know, let's say China, you are here, and India is doing the same thing 30 years later. So China did this 3 decades ago. We are here. So one could, not necessary, one could actually have an Indian emission path from coal which goes up like that, if the way at which we are growing, or the manner in which we are growing. That is not to argue that in the global south we have to take the bitter pill, none of that. So don't worry, I'm not going in that direction, that justice requires for us to carry the cross for the world. Absolutely not. Definitely not. A progressive economist from an institution like JNU would argue that you do the opposite, that the global south pays for it. No. At the same time, that global south is emitting is something that we need to accept. That it is not something which we can simply say, yes, it is our turn, you did it during your time, we are going to do it during our time. That's not how it works, for multiple reasons, which I will come to. So what do we, in terms of these 4 countries, if you pick US, China, EU, and India, this is a useless chart now, but still you can see the line here. This is what they committed. US itself, the commitment that they made is up here. So 2030 commitment. And this line, by the way, is up here. It's up to this point, it has reached here. So there's no way that they are actually going down. It's still on an average. Little bit here and there, the change is taking place. And the projections that they have made, this is from, they calculated this based on climate pledges. The calculation with the current commitments that they have made, or the way they are acting, this is not going to be anywhere in the range of what they themselves have committed. Whereas China and India are, at least in terms of the commitment that they have made, they are staying close to that. So the discussion with which we started, we call that the Z factor of the climate crisis. What do I mean by the Z factor? It's the following, that these countries which have emitted more than their share, what do we do with them? That is something that one could say, if they could emit negatively, you know, if it was possible that what they've emitted, it can be taken back, then you can say that, okay, fair, that is a possibility of a fair solution. But unfortunately, there is no such thing as negative emissions. At best, you can achieve is net zero, which means what is emitted is also absorbed. You have technologies in the sense that with the existing CCS technologies, existing natural resources, there is a certain emission absorption capacity that the global, that the world has. Your emissions, you can limit to that. That's the best you can do, in which case you will have a net zero. That's exactly the target that each of the countries are setting. That the emissions that I'm going to make gradually is going to go down and reach the limit at which they can be absorbed within my own country. That's basically your net zero. So there is emission, there is absorption. These two have to match. Absorption cannot go beyond your emission. That's not a possibility, despite all the claims to the contrary by the Bill Gates Foundation or Elon Musk, for example, that we are going to build a technology which is going to absorb all the carbon that is up there, and that is going to lead to net negative emissions. At least so far, there has not been any such technology which could do that. Given that, then there's no way that they can be made to give us net negative emissions. That is a problem which needs a solution. This is what she was referring to, that a point at which, if you reach, you can't go back. So what do we do? How do we respond to such a condition that you're in? Is not something that can come, at least on paper, or any of these COPs will be able to come to a solution of this serious a problem. So what this is just a way of explaining it. let's say this is the global north. It has promised to decarbonize its economy, and it reaches net zero as they have promised in 2050. They have said that by 2050, at least they have claimed, they are going to go to zero. This is net zero that you have there. Even then, they will be making positive emissions, right? Till they reach net zero, there will be positive emissions. This will further add to the deficit that they've already created in the global economy. So this is going to be an addition to that deficit. And if you have to have a fair solution, then this is what they will have to do over the next, let's say, 50 years when they do negative emissions, net negative. But as I've just said, this is an impossibility. It cannot be done. So the solutions that, so and for the global south, the argument has been that since we are late industrializers, we have a right to emit at least an increase in emission, and gradually. So that's a differential net zero target, as you know of. So 2050 is the net zero target for the global north. 2080, 2090, 2070 is for the global south. I'm sure you have heard of the commitment that India has made. I mean, our Prime Minister, when he went for the last COP meeting, he said that India also is accepting the net zero target in 2070, if I'm not mistaken. And this was, accepted with a lot of fanfare that, 2070 India has promised. A promise I can the moon also. I mean, that does not mean I'm going to necessarily deliver on it. But that aside, even if we were to do that, the point is it's still not fair, because they would have emitted what they have emitted. Additionally, they are emitting more than their share, so it's way beyond their 4 ratio that I had shown to you. And yet there is no compensation. There is nothing that they can do in terms of negative emissions. So how do we solve this problem? One solution that you would often hear about is the carbon trading framework. I'm sure everybody knows about it. And the argument is simple, that those who are in surplus sell their carbon credit to those who are in deficit. And fair, you're essentially getting paid for it. This is something which has been experimented. And in Europe, the carbon trading markets have been experimented with, and they've flopped. They have not worked. At least they have not delivered on the promise that they made. Why do you think that is the case? Why did they not deliver? Any guesses, anything that you can think of? Yes. Prices of?
Prices of the carbon emission, they were too low.
But why were they too low? Fair enough, yes.
Because the European Commission fixed it too low at the beginning, because this was consensus of all the European countries.
So one is simply the way that you would decarbonize. One is that you keep a cap, right? You can say that the emissions cannot go beyond that. The other possibility is you put a price to that carbon, and if you put a price to that carbon, things will become more expensive. If they become more expensive, consumption would go down. That's the idea behind, let's say, limiting emissions. But if the price that you set to that carbon is marginal, as he correctly said, then obviously the emissions are not going to go down. If you had capped it, then it would have. But if you cap it, then the prices of that would have been far, far higher. That's one possibility. The other is, which is what the governments did, where they capped it, they distributed the credit for free. As in the sense that you have permit, you don't sell the permit. You actually say that, okay, we've fixed the carbon. This carbon then we distribute across with some principle that we do. What will happen in that case? I basically get a share in the carbon, credit, but there I don't pay anything for it. So there is nothing in terms of payment that I would be making to anybody. And carbon trading mechanism in that sense, one obviously is whether you take it from the side of the cap or of pricing. In both, since there was no pricing of the fossil fuel industry, you basically need to extract profits from them. That's the only way in which you can actually, solve this problem. But carbon trading mechanism does not allow for that. The other is, which is the progressive forces, both in the north and the south. The progressive forces in the north, as you know of, the green growth framework, is essentially arguing for greening the economy, globally greening the economy, and also of the global north. And their argument, even though it solves the problem of climate change, let's say that you actually green all the economies, it's obvious that the emissions are going to go down at the pace at which they are arguing it should be done. They are saying basically 1.5% of the global GDP should be spent on energy transition. And their calculations tell them that by 2040, 2050, we would have made the energy transition to limit the carbon emissions to the 2 degrees Celsius limit that I had mentioned. But the point is, even if you were to do that, it won't solve the injustice side of it. Let's say you do this greening, at the end of the day, who's going to pay for it? If the greening of the economy in the global south, let's say of India or China, is going to be paid for our own citizens, then there's no compensation, reparations that was discussed earlier. There is no reparation in that sense. It's basically us paying for our own greening of the global south. The third framework, which is the progressive framework, or I don't know whether you call it progressive or not progressive, but progressive in some sense, is the carbon budget framework in the global south, which is arguing that it's our right to develop. So if it's our right, which is correct, that a standard of living that the global south needs to maintain, you have to have a better life, you have to have a decline in poverty and all of that. All of this can only happen with a higher level of GDP. I mean, how else? And a better distribution of GDP. So they're not against distribution, a fair distribution. But at the same time, their argument is, how do you create GDP without energy? I mean, you can't do it. So obviously, since we have not crossed our fair share, since we have not contributed to the problem, global south should be allowed to emit its fair share, right? That's basically the carbon budget framework in a nutshell. The problem would be that it is fair, of course, because you get your share, but it's not it's not solving the crisis that we are faced with. So all these different things are either erring on the side of solving one of the problems or neither of the problems of climate justice and of climate crisis. But is there a way in which it actually both can be addressed? Is something that I would like to discuss towards the end. Before I go there, I just want to say something about this development issue. This juxtaposing development against emission is something which is at least currently a false debate in our opinion, for the following reason, that you need energy, but you don't need brown energy necessarily for it. You can actually have growth in the global south, which is green in nature, and this is not something which we are talking about future. This is already there. The global north is already doing it. So it's not as if that it cannot happen. It can happen, but whether we should pay for it, that's a fair question. But those who are arguing for, let's say, energy transition in the global south are not arguing for degrowth. No, nobody is, and one should not, because we are not at the standard of living that the global north, as you just saw, the citizens in the global north are. Our people are poor. Our people don't have employment, fair employment, decent employment. There is precariousness in employment. All of that needs to be addressed, but that does not need to come at the cost of climate. It's possible to do it differently, and that possibility is what we need to explore. Only if we accept this fact that we also need to contribute. We also need to contribute to this fight. So what do we do? What is the way in which it can be done? And we believe the only way it can be done is, while there is no net negative possible, but global net zero is possible, of course. So even though the global south is emitting, the rate at which it emits, it can decline over a period of time, but at the cost of the north. I will explain this. Just give me a few minutes to explain. So you basically had this part which needed to be paid for, or which needed to happen from the global north. They should have made the negative emissions, right? That's not possible. This can, however, be absorbed up there. It is possible that the emissions from now on that take place, that need not necessarily take place. Am I making sense? So, for example, the commitment that the global south is making of net zero in the future, that can be advanced. How do you advance that? That can be advanced by the global north compensating and making the energy transition in the global south itself. That is the way in which you can solve both the problems. Net negative emissions are not possible, yes, but global net zero is possible. And how do you do that? You absorb this thing that you have here from this share, but not at the cost of the south, entirely borne by the north. And the principle on which it can be borne is based on the stocks of emission. There are multiple ways in which it can be solved. One is that, I mean, these things are just dropping. So one is you create an international carbon fund, which is a progressive institution, not like the IMF, where obviously every country has equal voting right. You may say that all of this is an ideal world, so on and so forth, but all COPs are actually wanting to have that ideal world. The problem with COPs, at least in my opinion, is that the global south is divided. You go to any, I mean, you discuss anything on COP, you will see South Africa individually negotiating with the global north about the compensation that they had promised. India is talking about phasing out coal. Somebody else is talking about phasing down coal, so on and so forth. India didn't say phasing out, but the negotiation that happened towards the end was about whether we write phasing out or phasing down of coal. But the substance of this is never in terms of the collective. Despite all the efforts that we make, it is all at the individual countries trying to negotiate. Whereas our experience is from WTO, the biggest example of that, most of the times that we have actually managed to win battles is when we have fought collectively in these trade negotiations. That's the only way in which we have won these battles, and that's exactly what the global south would need to do, is to ask for this exact compensation which needs to be made. That money is what is to be used for greening the economies in the global south, which essentially solves then both the problems together. And in a way, in effect, north basically absorbs its additional emissions or the excess emissions that they have already taken place. It does not come at the cost of development in the global south, because you essentially have development which is taking place through energy which is green in nature, which is not of the kind that we are currently using. Just two more slides and I'll explain what ways in which it can be done. So one of such a possibility is if you think of this whole thing in terms of flows. So whoever is emitting more than the global average, they pay. Whoever is emitting less than the global average, they receive. So you have basically an international carbon fund or fund of that kind. So this exercise we did for a paper where we did it on terms of flows. It can be done with stocks as well. So it's a simple, I mean, not a simple exercise, a lot of calculations have gone into it, but it's a simple exercise in the following manner. Let's say the average is X. Whoever crosses that average, that country pays. How much? By the extent of their limit that they've exceeded by. So if they're 2X, then they essentially be paying for that extra X entirely. Then it depends on the population of that country. If the population of that country is large, then the emissions, I mean, then their contribution would have to be even larger, so on and so forth. And the same thing happens with the deficit, with the surplus countries. Those who have not reached the average, they receive. The further below they are from the average, the more they receive. That's the way in which this compensation is essentially the reparation, principle of reparation that one could think of, is the way in which this can be done. And here you see China as being a pair nation. The reason why it's a pair nation is because it's based on flow. This calculation has been done on flows. And in terms of flows, China is more than the global average. So obviously they are the pair nation. But that's not a necessity. And this is the recipient because India happens to be below the global average, both in stocks and flows. So it will benefit. India is a beneficiary in both the scheme of things. This compensation is that compensation for not reaching their fair share and yet being able to develop the way they would like to. A different framework which does not take flow into account but just goes by the stock is a recent paper which came out. This is by Fanning and Hickel, the degrowth school. Their argument is that you basically compensate based on the stocks of emissions, which is obviously also fair and fairer in some ways, where all the countries, those 4.0, the shares that you had, those countries are all here. How much, the extent to which they've exceeded, they contribute to that fund, which is compensation due for atmospheric appropriation. So the numbers they have calculated, just as we have calculated, is based on that. This is the total fund that gets accumulated here. And then it gets distributed across countries based on how much of their share they are left with. So India is up there, as I've said, because it has a huge population. So obviously our share is much higher, fair share in budget, and we get if this were to happen, then this is the amount that India should get. China should be getting that, Sub-Saharan Africa, and rest of the world being rest of the global south here. This kind of a compensation or a reparation, a better word for this, from the global north is the only way in which you can both make a global energy transition and at the same time addressing the global injustice problem. So the Z factor, which is what we started with, the only possible solution to that, which does not put the burden on any one section of the population, can only happen through a compensation of this kind. And there are multiple principles based on which these numbers can be arrived at. Numbers are easy to get. This getting into action requires political movement. And there have been examples where these things have indeed happened. One such example is British Columbia, where they, unlike in the the European carbon market, what they did was different. In a state, in a local thing, what they did was they put a tax on carbon. Now, immediately, obviously, it's like the French experiment. You increase the prices of fossil fuels, and there is a yellow vest movement that all of us know about. There is a reaction, and justifiable reaction from the working people. But it did not happen in British Columbia, because what they did was they taxed, but the fund that they got, they redistributed per capita. So actually, poor people got more than what they paid. So in net, there was a carbon dividend that they got, whereas they paid taxes which were far, far lower, and the rich essentially paid for that. So there was, you could call it a Robin Hood tax, where you've taxed the state taxes, but it redistributes that tax across individuals. Now, what the situation is from the British Columbia experience is that people are now asking for that taxation policy, which was decent enough, and the taxes are rising, to be done across the country. That is the way in which you can, which is more a political response to both this injustice and the climate crisis problem, where you address the question of class, where you address the question of the climate crisis simultaneously, is the only way forward, where you can build movements, where you can bring people together. Otherwise, you will actually be always countering one movement against the other, which actually is not required for this problem to be solved. So that's all I wanted to discuss. Thank you for listening to me patiently.